Welcome to another episode of Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and this is my husband and co-host, Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow! Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. I'm Cindi Baldi, and across the way from me is Geoffrey Tumlin.
Yellow!
And we are talking today about the horrendous, horrible situation of either being a co-boss with somebody or having to be the subordinate of two bosses.
Yeah, this idea of having co-CEOs or two people supervising the same function. So we'll start with one of our horror stories of this. All of them, in our experience doing this for 19 years, have been horror stories. But just one from about 10 years ago, we did a project, two people who were at the top of the organization, co-leading it, and they were actually great friends, loved each other, but the two, they're literally half of the office was under one half and half was under the other, and they were the co-leaders. It's kind of like two pipes going straight down. And never the two did meet. It was so bad that they had a post office box about 2 miles from the office, and every day they would go and get the mail. And they had to send two groups because this group would go to the same P.O. box but only pull out the mail for them, and this group would have to go and get their mail. And it was just nuts. And they could never piece it together. And in the end, one of the two left. And then they hired somebody above the other one, and so it just became more of a normal organization. And by the way, they had to fire probably about a third of the people to make that work because people were still, even with the new structure, there was still that bad blood from back when it used to be the Hatfields versus the McCoys. And so hate it whenever we hear co-CEO, co-manager. I've never seen it work. Have you?
No, I've never seen it work. And that example that you just gave was notable because the two people actually really liked each other. The two co-chiefs, they really liked each other. The problem was a difference in disposition. Yeah. And not that they both weren't nice people, but one of them was harmony at all costs and never would address any issues. And so his side of the organization would be upset with the other side because they weren't doing what they knew they should be doing and nobody was calling them out on it.
Yeah.
And so that's a little different than normal because normally it's, the two people actually themselves don't get along. So if we're going to talk about the problems that usually happen when you have co-bosses, I think that's the first one is usually the two co-bosses don't get along that well, just from the simple fact that it's not clear who's responsible for what, and they keep bouncing into each other, and it's really irritating to try to do a job and then have somebody come along and also be doing it, and
sure,
it just feels like a waste.
Yeah. Yeah, there's in the science, as I know as we talk about this a lot, there is this term called role conflict or role ambiguity. I mean, they're different but interrelated. They're different, I should say, but a lot of times they'll co-occur. One is where there's conflict as to who does what, and I want that or I want that, and the other is when you're not sure who does what,
and so you're all running around trying to do it all.
That's right. Yeah, and nothing irritates people more than doing something and realizing that somebody else is doing the same thing. We're in a similar kind of situation now. One of the places where we work, where same type idea, except instead of being two co-CEOs, they had a big part of the organization that had somebody who left unexpectedly. And so they put somebody temporarily covering one of the main roles in this organization. And then when they got a replacement for the person who left, they didn't take the piece that this guy had been doing. And so a new person came in to her kingdom, and there was this existing manager doing one of the core functions. And it hasn't gotten pulled apart. I mean, basically, there's a fight between the existing manager who says, this is always part of my role and it's what I signed on for. Why am I not doing it? But the other manager doing that role doesn't want to leave it because it came with a stipend, and he likes the money and he likes the status. And so it's this, anytime in an organization when two people, or when it's not clear about who's actually in charge of a function, usually that's throws off a lot of problems. And we get involved in a lot of that. As organizational consultants, we get called into a lot of these problems.
We're almost always the mediators.
Yeah, which is one reason why, and I that scenario I gave, I actually spent 2 hours trying to mediate that not too long ago. And there's no mediation because the person who needs to decide is the CEO, and that person is too busy to actually make the call. And so the thing is limping along, and it's confusing for everybody. And so it's people need to know, where do I go when I have a question? Who's actually in charge of this particular part of my job? Or, in the extreme case of having two bosses, which is a variation of this. We started with the example of basically co-CEOs, but there's a variation of this problem is when all of a sudden I have more than one boss and my time is split. Can you talk a little bit about some of the problems with that and things you recommend for when people find themselves working with more than one boss?
Well, the default is that, and it almost always seems this way. I don't know if it's fundamentally a difference in personality. I think if you're going to have two bosses, which from an organizational standpoint, I'd never recommend, because the reason why there's a department is like there's kind of a structure around it and it works for one person to be overseeing that. But if you're going to have it, then they need to be very similar in disposition and willingness to handle conflict, because even small differences, like the fact that the first example that you gave, that one of the CEOs was high in harmony. It's not like the other guy is mean. It's just he'll address things.
Sure.
And so what will happen is that you wind up pleasing the person who is more willing to address issues, or the person who will be more likely to make your life miserable if there's a big personality difference, because you're going in and you're like, I can't, you didn't figure this out for me. I'm not going to be able to figure it out. I'm going to make my life easier, and I'm going to play to the person who has the potential to make my life a lot worse.
Yeah.
And so the person who is more conflict avoidant, or sometimes just a nicer person in terms of disposition, they're going to lose in this. And it's really hard to, and so it's very frustrating for them, but it's also frustrating for the person who always feels like they're the bad guy. It's really not that dissimilar to having two parents.
Yeah.
And, employees, they were once kids and they grew up playing their parents off of each other. If parents didn't provide like a solid wall, and, most parents struggle with that. And so why would you put that into your structure for an organization? And if you're getting given that opportunity, you should walk away. Like everybody we've ever had that wound up in this position, it's because they wanted to rise in the organization and this was the best deal that they got. But you know what? If you're
being a co, you mean?
Being a co, and then their life is miserable and they almost all want to go back to just being an employee, And you'd be better off not going through that pain and just being like, I'd love to promote, but I don't think that this structure works.
Yeah.
I'm happy to stay as an employee. And then you make a decision. Like, either you're going to stay as an employee and have a much easier life, in terms of, like, obviously there are things about being an employee that aren't great, or, there aren't perks, but that, you're going to have like a regular schedule and you're not going to be working more than 40 hours a week without getting paid, because most of these managers are salaried. So stay the employee, or make the decision that you're going to stay the employee for a while and you're going to give the organization a chance to maybe give you another opportunity, or that you're going to start seeking outside if you really are very ambitious. Do not take that double management role, because you think you're going to be the exception. You're never the exception. It's a flawed structure.
Yeah. Yes, I know exactly when you said that, who you're thinking about. And I agree that our recommendation is, I can't think of a time we've ever recommended somebody agree to a shared leadership, meaning we're going to co-manage this. Not that we're on a project and you take this part, I take this part, because that's clear. I'm doing this, you're doing that. The co-managing of a division or a department, that's where we've always seen trouble in that. And the problem originates, the original sin is a person or a group of people who weren't willing to actually make the call and say, this is the one we're picking for the job.
Yeah, usually it winds up being one person who has been in the organization a long time. And so they kind of, above them feels like the expectation is there, and sort of the loyalty element makes you feel like, well, maybe we should do this. But then there's this other person that they actually want to give the job to.
Yeah.
And this is like, find a way, like, make a decision. Like, if the person who's been there forever, like, are they actually legitimately the right skill set, the right disposition? Because remember, like, they could be like really good at their technical job, but as soon as you move them up into a management position, then their ability to handle social elements skyrockets. It's not really as much about the task as it is about managing people. And so, yes, they need to have whatever skills are required, because a lot of our managers are also working managers. So they need to have whatever skills are required to do the job, but they also have to have the social awareness and social capabilities, which can be taught, to actually lead people within the organization.
Yeah.
And, so if you're going to do that, then do that. Develop them, put them in that position, give them an actual fair shot, and look for something else for that other person. Or don't develop that person and take the person you really want and put them into that position.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. That is where we see a lot of the reasons that they'll pick two instead of just picking one. This idea of two bosses or two managers co-leading something, we don't like it from the position of how it starts in the beginning. Just make the call. Pick one. It'll be a lot cleaner for the organization, and it's a lot more honest to the people going for the job. Who's getting it, who is getting the job, and who's not. For the people in the running being offered a joint job, be very careful. I've never recommended somebody take a co-job.
I've never seen it work.
Yep. And
that doesn't mean it doesn't at some places, but I've never seen it work.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think the science on this, on co-CEOs, is negative. That's my recollection. Every time a company has a co-CEO, I'm trying to think of the recent one. I can't remember. It's not Twitter, but there's a big company that had a co-CEO structure, and eventually one of the people just left. mean, there was a kind of a co-structure at Google for a while with the two founders, but eventually they brought in Eric Schmidt to actually run the place and let the founders be the founders and have Eric actually running all the employees in the organization.
I think we see it sometimes, and I guess maybe this would be the exception to the rule. I think we see it sometimes with like succession planning. Like the current CEO knows that they're going to leave.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
So they start literally handing over the job while on the job.
Yeah.
And that can kind of feel a little bit like that, especially if the CEO doesn't do a very good job of handing over the job.
Yeah, and you got to make sure the CEO can actually do it. I mean, we're in places where the CEO starts handing stuff to somebody, but it's the board actually picking. And so it's a gamble, right? The board needs to actually pick. The CEO can hand projects over all he or she wants. But when the CEO actually leaves, it's not a sure thing that that's going to be the selection. And so it's, it's a bad idea even in that case, because as soon as you make it clear who your successor is, you become a lame duck. And, okay, we're just waiting. Here goes the new person. And then, there's I hear what you're saying, but even that, if it's a private company and there can actually be a selection, meaning there's not a board, that the company's small enough to where the CEO actually controls who's next, then okay, I could see that being the part of the succession plan. And everybody knows the CEO's transferring into a different position is going to become more of a...
it's less of a lame duck situation too, because as long as they're still in position, they still actually have power.
Yeah.
But like, that's part of the dance, right? Like you can't then undermine the person who you're trying to put into position whenever you feel like it. Yeah.
It's back to this role conflict, role ambiguity. Where do I go if I have a question? You don't like it because it kind of plays, people can play off one parent to another, so to speak. Your insight, which I think is a good one, is that sometimes in a company, we actually please the more demanding one.
It may not be the one you like the most. It's just, you're going to make your life easier.
Yeah, let me keep them out of my hair. And so I actually lean in their direction and are more responsive to them. Whereas I may still go to the nice parent when I'm making a request for, a long vacation or a vacation on top of vacation or whatever, where I need a little favor. I may still go to the good cop, but I'm spending a unusual amount of my time actually making the bad cop stay out of my hair. And so it's a dilution of focus. Nobody knows where to go. And the one thing that I don't think we've talked about yet, which I think makes a lot of sense to me for us to discuss briefly, is it's very hard for those two people co-leading to actually pull it off. And I think we've seen a lot of variations of this in the original story that I mentioned. In the company where the two people were good friends and they were co-CEOs, they weren't able to stop the company from fighting with each other.
They weren't able to stop the fracture.
Yeah.
There was CEO 1's people and CEO 2's people, and the two groups were actually in conflict with each other.
Yeah, it's too easy to take sides. I mean, it's hard enough to not have operations think marketing is wasting their time, and marketing think there never would be any customers unless they were doing their job, and everybody getting upset with the top managers against the line staff. There's all these natural cleavages or fault lines in organizations.
But at least you usually have your little cluster.
Yeah.
And your little cluster can be very cohesive, but you put two managers up there and that cohesion goes away. There's going to be a divide. Yep,
I completely agree with you. Where do I go? now I have to play two supervisors. I have to pay attention to both of them.
You can get yelled at by both of them, and you can do what one of them wants and then turn around and get yelled at by the other, and the other won't accept the fact that you were doing what the other one told you to do. It's a terrible setup for employees.
Yeah. And like you said, easy for it to kind of split off. Hard for the people supposedly to be the co-managers, even if they like each other, to keep it together. And then, this will be the last time I say it because I mentioned it before, but it's an abdication of the people responsible for actually picking. Why didn't you actually pick one? And again, totally agree with what you said. Well, we didn't pick because there's somebody we want and then there's somebody senior. And when we pick the person we want, we know that the senior person is going to be upset. And if we pick the senior person, we know the person we want may be upset.
Yeah, in the ideal world, you pick the person that you think can actually do the job best, which is usually not the person with loyalty if you're in this spot where you're trying to put two people over a group.
Yeah.
And then you turn around and you have the conversation with the person who was expecting the position but didn't get it because, you need to have a conversation with them. Yeah. Like, do they actually want this in the future? And if they do, what do you need to see from them in order for you to feel good about giving them that job? And then whatever training that they need, support that.
Yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis that you bring up, but I wonder if almost every co-manager, co-department chair, co-CEO, if almost every single case of that is actually a failure of somebody to pick the right person for the job.
Which almost immediately means that there's not going to be any help from above you to actually resolve the issues of you and your code.
That's right. Yeah, because you're looking for help, deconflicting. Yeah, it's like an irony that you're going to be plunked into a place where the structure is in question, but you can't go and get clarity on it because it's the original sin is the decision maker didn't want to provide the clarity of, we prefer you.
Hello, Musers. Now it's time for commercial break. Time to ring the register. We're going to talk about group coaching.
Oh, yeah. One of our favorite things. We run a lot of it through On-Demand Leadership, ondemandleadership.com. Group coaching sessions have 3 parts. One part, talk about what's going on in the organization. Part 2, an elective topic that the people in the room or the senior leaders pick, and we bring it. Can be anything that's kind of hot or current or meaningful from the science. Right now, psychological safety is hot. It's the start of the year. We always do a lot of habits, formation, stuff like that. And then the third part is in talking about the organization and the elective, we do a lot of assessments and exercises that shed a little light on the people in the room and how they work together. And in doing those 3, we learn a little, we talk a little about the organization in a space that's facilitated so that the key leaders don't have to bear responsibility for the conversation.
That's a big advantage because then they can just be part of the conversation.
Yeah. We tell people a lot in these sessions that the way that you know that you don't need the sessions anymore is when anything we're talking about, you can have similar conversations in other meetings. And almost all of our clients keep these sessions going for many, many, many years. We're in our 10th year in one of our clients, 9th and 8th year doing these and others. Because it's very hard to replicate these group coaching sessions if you don't have an external facilitator, because it just becomes a task-oriented admin meeting. That's the default. And the job of our role is to make sure that doesn't happen. Actually clear the space. They're usually 4 hours each. It deepens the bonds. It's serious conversation about the company and a little bit of learning and a lot of laughter along the way. On-demand leadership group coaching sessions call us. Trust me, you'll love it. It's a lot of fun.
I think you never lose by developing the people underneath you to take your job, because
Sure.
you
Agree.
You want to go on vacation and have not to come back to a mess, and you have to, I mean, like, ethically, you should want the organization to be able to like pick up and move on if you were to die in a car accident or, you know, like unexpectedly. And, you know, ethically, like, we should be helping the people below us develop. And yes, they may not get that job, but then they're more prepared for, you know, the next job that they're applying for.
Yeah. And we're all learning. Is the manager, you're getting better, and so you're climbing up your capabilities, they're climbing up, and so the jobs are, you know, the jobs are changing anyway.
It's just that's a window of time where there can be a little bit of playing mom and dad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from this conversation, the two things that you said that are very intriguing to me are, the first is your point that with two bosses, we'll often actually spend more of our time placating the mean one, the demanding one. And I'm running that through my mental filter and then the kind of different studies I've read over the years. And I think you're right. But that's against conventional wisdom, where you usually think people want to lean towards nice cop or nice mom instead of mean dad. But I think you're right. We actually try to placate the mean one when we've got two people, or the demanding one. And that's the first thing that is insightful to me and a little counterintuitive. And the second thing is the original sin of a ton of these selections of co-leaders or co-managers is, I know who I want to hire and I'm going to give a job to that person. But I also know the senior person who's been loyal to us, who I really don't want to hire, but is going to be upset. And I need to throw them a bone too. And that's how we end up with a large percentage of the co-leader, co-manager positions that we've seen, is that failure of a higher level leader to actually pick. And that sets the two people up, which is why your advice is good. You know, our advice pretty consistently is to tell people not to take jobs like this where they're going to be co-lead. Is it sets you up in a quandary where you're going to have to split a job with somebody. That's throwing off a lot of role conflict and role ambiguity. And the person you would normally go to fix that is the very person who didn't have the courage to actually pick one of you and tell the other one you didn't get the job.
Sometimes these dual things are actually structure issues in an organization. And that's the ambiguity piece, where it's like two people at the same level and they don't have like good boundaries. And so one or both are stomping on each other.
And that's not officially co-leader. That's just the job is ambiguous.
Yes. If you keep hiring for a particular position and they keep getting in conflict with the same,
yes, true,
you have a structure problem.
Yeah. Cindy's talking about a place we worked where they hired a new executive position, but they didn't clear out the space for the person. And they told the person, you need to do X, Y, and Z.
And that person did not think that was enough. That did not feel like enough of a job. The person was actually very skilled and a hard worker. And so she started finding other ways to contribute, but those other ways were stomping on her peer. Yeah.
And the peers actually didn't want her doing all of X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And so I know this sounds crazy, but this happens. Organizations spend a lot of money to hire an executive for a role, and then they don't actually give that person enough internal authority to do the job. And that's, again, we get called in for a lot of this. And you couldn't fix that. Conflict ended up getting so bad that that person left. And it's a good point that you make.
But and that person was the third or fourth person in that role who had had the same exact problem.
Same exact problem. Yeah. Yeah, and they, to their credit, after she left, they did away with the role. They totally changed it. They basically dropped it. It became subordinate to all these people.
I mean, that was what I hammered home, was that, like, yes, that some of the behaviors are not ideal coming from this person, but you actually have a structure problem, and you need to fix the structure problem. Well,
they took your advice. If you are offered to be a co-leader of something formally, no matter how much you like the other co-leader, I think our advice would be don't take it for all the reasons that we've discussed. It's basically somebody didn't have the courage to make the singular call, and probably that very person you're going to be counting on to deconflict the inevitable structural problems. If you're in the position of needing to pick somebody for a job, resist the urge to pick two.
Bring in other people to make a decision. Take a vote. Everybody's got to pick one. Like, whatever you have to do to actually come to one person, and then be fair to the other person. Have the conversation with them and explain why they didn't get the job, and what they would need to do in the future to be eligible for the job, or to be better positioned for the job. Don't let them sit there and languish in silence and wondering what happened.
Yep. All right. I think that's it. That's all I want to say about it. Don't take the job. Make the structure clear. A lot of our work comes back to having a clear and sensible structure in an organization. And these dual roles, I've never seen one work out well. There may be examples out there, but they're outside of our orbit. And we frequently get called in to try to sort through the turf battles. This is not really a turf battle, but just the ambiguity created when there's a duel.
The drama that's created when there's a duel.
I understand.
No drama.
Yep.
Thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate you, and likes and downloads and stars and
all of it.
Spreading it around. Thank you, everybody. You have a good one till next time.
Yep. See you later.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about the topic, check out our show notes. And if you want to help us out, like, share, subscribe, and 5 stars are all deeply appreciated. See you next time on the Management Muse.